If all you knew about the Gilded Age, that period in American history from 1877 till about 1900, was this photograph, it wouldn't look particularly gilded at all. In fact, this looks like a very dreary scene. But there's a lot more going on here. Take a look at this photograph carefully. A lot of activity out on the streets. Definitely this is an urban landscape, not an agrarian one. All kinds of people walking about, going about their business. It's probably wintertime because you can see the snow on the ground. But that mist hanging in the air may not just be fog or snow. It also could be what we would basically call smog today. That's because there's a lot of industrialization going on. The number of horses you see in that street gives you a very early idea of the sort of challenges that a Gilded Age city faced in terms of transportation and cleanliness, because those horses have to go somewhere as they're going about their business. But you get a really good idea of what the Gilded Age is like just in this sense of movement and of energy. And that really is the central theme in this entire lecture. Here, we're going to be focusing on the social and cultural life of Gilded Age America, what it means to be an American, what American life is like in this period, how much it's changing, what the American city is like, and how very much it's changing. This isn't about politics, it's not about economics, it's not about labor unions, it's really just about everyday life in Gilded Age America. But that central theme is one that I want you to keep in mind, because it's easy for us, particularly unless something happened just in the last 20 years or so, to assume that history is basically old, dead, and done, that there is, you put your fingers on it, there is no pulse. The reality is, if you were to put your fingers on the Gilded Age, you would actually feel a pulse. It is one of the most alive periods in all of American history.
And this
Here's an example of that, an early precursor to the world in which we
record
live. We
has
are,
been
for the
made
first time, you're
by
listening to me
Alexander
now talk to
Graham
you,
Bell
even though I'm pretty
in
far
the
away from you.
presence of
That's
Dr.
unusual to us.
Christopher A.
But
Bell
130 years
on the
ago, that
16th
really caused
of
quite a
April,
ruckus. Then it became
1885
possible.
at the
Alexander Graham
Delta
Bell
Laboratory,
invented the phonograph, had to
where
work
a
out what a phonograph was going to
1921
play.
Pacific
And so he
Avenue,
actually was able to
Washington,
record his
D.C.
voice in
in
April of
Whistler,
1885
Florida,
on that
you
recording
are
set.
now
Now, this is a
heard.
very, very early recording. It's in horrible shape by the time the Smithsonian came to release it. But they were able
Alexander
to clean it up
Graham
enough that they could
Bell.
actually hear his voice. Listen to this. And what you're going to hear is what you're seeing on the screen in the little inset. Can you imagine that? That you now live in an age by 1885 in which somebody can actually record their voice. This is a period in which national senses are heightened in every way, and there's this palpable sense of expectation in the air that something big is always around the next corner. And it makes sense that we would have opened this up with a photograph. Photography became a very big deal during the Civil War, but most of those photographs are rather grisly and depressing. By the time you get into the Gilded Age, though, you start seeing photography as an art form unto itself to capture everyday life, to capture immigrant life, to record what later on muckrakers will see needs for reform. But everything about this period you can actually see and apparently hear happening around you, too. And we're going to begin by examining these images of Gilded Age America. Because in a lot of ways, the Gilded Age is all about this image and reality, the magic and the mayhem all mixed in there together. Mark Twain coined the term Gilded Age to make fun of what he saw as something that was gilded on top, which means it's gold layered and looks all pretty and shiny on top, but basically rotten underneath. Historians picked that up, liked the idea, and said, oh yes, this is what the Gilded Age is like. The Gilded Age is the seedy, nasty, horrible, corrupt part of American history that looks shiny on top, but actually is horrible and rotten underneath. That will be followed later on by the Progressive Era, which is uplifting and reform-minded and virtuous. In reality, the Gilded Age was all those things. It was reform-minded and virtuous and seedy and rotten and beautiful. All of it is real. All the wonderful things you see in this lecture are all real. All the bad things are all real. This is part of what makes this period so dynamic. When you look at the images of Gilded Age America, the way it's come down to us, and the way the people living then were experiencing it, these are people who are very aware of the age in which they live. You see this emerge in terms of literature, in photography, in architecture, and in landscape. But what you're seeing across the board is that theme there at the bottom. The tension and the ongoing pull and push between nature or the elements and human beings' ability to actually control the environment around them, literally and figuratively. In terms of literature, you see this evident in two major literary movements. There is the local colorist, to begin with. This is a tradition that focused on exploring all the little diverse nooks and crannies of American life. Now, some of this is a reaction to the growing urbanization in the United States. More and more people are moving towards or into the cities, but they still have this longing for the sort of good old days of rural life. And what you see in local colorist is very often an attention to that, but not just some vague idea about farms in America. Instead, you see very specific treatments, very local treatments of, let's say, nooks and crannies of American life. Hamlin Garland, in 1891, publishes a book called Main Traveled Roads, all about farm families living in the upper Midwest. Sarah Orne Jewett, in 1896, publishes a story called Country of the Pointed Firs, a nostalgic look at Americans living in Maine. And then in 1880, a man named Joel Chandler Harris publishes a collection called Uncle Remus. Now, Uncle Remus is one of those books that in the last 20 or 30 years has been yanked off of every bookshelf in school libraries. It was widely condemned as racist and insensitive. The reality of that is a terrible shame, because Harris went about trying to gather original, and not African American, but African folk tales that first and second generation slaves brought with them as part of the Middle Passage and then gradually passed down through all the generations to come. When you read them, yes, they sound insensitive and people don't like the dialect, but he was genuinely trying to capture this slice of American life, and a slice of American life that had come not from the United States or even from the American colonies, but from Africa itself. And then there is Mark Twain, most famously for Adventures of Huckleberry Finn that came out in 1884. But Twain was the first really great American writer. Not the first distinctly American, but the first really great American one. In fact, Ernest Hemingway, who himself later on will win numerous prizes as a writer in the 20th century, said that all modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. Another one of those books that you need to put on your list of Read Before I Die. Another book that got yanked off of school shelves, but one that is an extraordinary examination not just of the nooks and crannies of life on the Missouri River, but the relationships between a boy and a slave and the relationships of what it means to be human in this period. So local color is one theme. And most of these tend to be lighthearted and uplifting, and it's sort of the warm, comfy stories you read by a fire. The other tradition is literary naturalism, very different. This is a tradition that views people as vulnerable to both man-made and to natural environments. It could be the Klondike in Alaska, like in Jack London's story. It could be the grittiest part of a city somewhere. One example of this is Jack London. In 1903, he publishes a story called The Call of the Wild, all about the triumph of the animal world. Then there's Theodore Dreiser. Sister Carrie comes out in 1900. You guys will be reading the first chapter of that. Carrie survives a life of illicit affairs to become a success, so you know how the story is going to end. But later on, Dreiser wrote another book called An American Tragedy in 1925, all about a young man so obsessed with sex and money that he murders his pregnant mistress to marry into a wealthy family. An American Tragedy was an enormously popular book. It's been made into a movie at least twice. And then there was Stephen Crane. In 1895, he wrote a book about a young man in the Civil War called Red Badge of Courage. But in 1893, he wrote the story that you guys are reading, Maggie, A Girl of the Streets. Maggie is a tenement girl drawn into prostitution. Eventually she dies, so you know how this one's going to end too. You'll know how this one's going to end by the time you're done with the first chapter, though. It's that obvious. The book was so vivid that Crane had to finance its publication himself because everybody he took it to said, this is basically just trash. No respectable person is going to want to buy this. But as you read Maggie, first, I warn you, you'll probably want to take a shower by the time this is over because her life is so awful. But you also get a sense in Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, a very good sense of this desire and the tension between wanting to get out of one world, wanting to choose her own fate, but the world she seems to be locked into and cannot seem to get herself out of. Now we compare all those images with some hard facts too, because of all the stories that come out in this period, the central character very often isn't a person, it's the city itself. Big business, industrialization, and railroads combined led to the mass urbanization of the United States after the Civil War. Now, cities had always existed, mainly in New England, but their size and their character and even the vision of what a city should be changes right around the turn of the century. Look at this chart. In 1880, New Orleans was the only real city in the entire South, and San Francisco, the only one in the West. But 1920, just 40 years later, just over one generation, 15 to 20 new cities, each with a population of 50,000 or more, had developed in the South and in the West. This is the emergence of cities like Los Angeles, noted for its clean air, by the way, Seattle, Minneapolis, Omaha, Kansas City, and Omaha and Kansas City. That doesn't seem, everyone goes, oh yeah, the big city of Omaha. But Omaha and Kansas City, those are rising up, not because of industrialization, but because of the railroad and because of the cattle drives. Atlanta, Birmingham, Houston. But this is very much a national trend. When you look at this map, you see how much the cities have grown. And it's not just big places like Philadelphia or in New York, those sorts of things that are relatively large to begin with. But look there in the Midwest around Indianapolis, particularly Chicago is the big gain. But you see all those little red dots, all of those are brand new cities where people are settling. Now, some of this is because immigrants are pouring onto eastern shores and then will gradually move westward, end up in the Midwest. You see the growth of cities around much of the South, some of them much, much smaller than they will be by today's standards. There across Florida, several very small things. Miami is completely missing off this map, but that's a story that comes another several weeks into class. You see the growth in the West, Seattle, Portland. This is from people who had been coming on the overland trails and had now established larger cities. There's San Francisco. They're along California's coastline. But all these little scatterings exist, but you really see in this period where the big growth is happening. It's there in the Midwest, and then the continued expansion of what you see in New England. But this is happening nationwide. And it's not just particular cities, it's the entire idea of urbanization. From 1860 to 1920, the American population triples from 31 million to 105 million. But the urban population within that increases 9 times from 6 million to 54 million. In 1860, and this is a number I will drill into your head for the entire rest of the class, so remember it. In 1860, 20% of Americans lived in cities. In 1920, for the first time, based on the 1920 census, 50% of Americans lived in cities. So until 1920, most Americans do not live in cities. Most Americans still farm for a living. But 1920 is that big watershed year.